Welcome to the archive, Sally North. I'm so excited about this because today we are talking about Irish history and Irish magic, subjects I have wanted to cover, and finally that door is fully opened. So, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you, Garrett. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about Irish magic and Irish history. I hope it'll be something interesting for all your followers.
In like the modern era, there's definitely a lot of terminology and people will say, well, this is what the Celtics might have used, and this is what the Norse used, and there's a lot of things that get thrown around. And so I'm curious. We were talking about Celtic and Irish magic, uh,
Yes,
and is there a distinctive difference between, like, even in the history, the Celtic people and the Irish people?
it's one of those things that has just the two terms have become to some extent interchangeable, and it's hard to sometimes separate them out. Um, you see a lot of things around about, Celtic magic, Celtic shamanism, Celtic this, Celtic that, but most of the time they're actually talking about Irish people. Now, Irish people are Celtic, and we know the Celts came here. We actually speak a Celtic language. But are we Celts? Well, we're a lot of things, and that's one of the amazing things about Ireland. The Celts actually turned up quite late in the game. A lot of the things we associate with a magical pagan Ireland are from the Neolithic period. The great stone monuments, um, probably the stories of the great heroes from the Táin, from the Leabhar Gaval and the Heron, which is our proto-history. Um, but were those people Celts? It's actually very hard to say. Um, And by the time people started to look at Irish culture and history as a very distinct thing, here we are, stuck on the edge of Western Europe. Most of mainstream Europe has moved on quite a bit. Other people have come to live there. Um, the Irish are living in a kind of little backwater, if you like. Obviously, we don't think that, but those are the facts. We're one of the last people in the world to still be speaking a Celtic language. Um, so the tendency is always to lump Celtic and Irish together, and sometimes you do have to tease them apart a little bit, um, because Celt in the European sense refers to a huge number of people who occupied most of Western Europe for quite a long period of time. But when we're talking about, Irish magic, we're talking sometimes about uniquely Irish things, which may have been the same all over Europe. We know there are similarities, huge similarities between Ireland, Scotland, possibly the very little we know of Celtic Britain. Um, so being left at the edge of Europe and carrying on a language, a culture, and tradition that may have been quite more widespread. I don't get too upset when people keep just using the word Celtic for Ireland. Archaeologists sometimes get upset about it, and linguists as well. But for most intents and purposes, the Irish are Celts, and some Celts are Irish.
So, where does the identity of Ireland or the Irish begin?
It's hard to say because it probably emerged in the era before we had any written records of ourselves. So this is where being a oral culture can be hugely disadvantageous later on, which is if you don't write things down about yourselves, other people will come along and write your stories for you. So some of our very old texts only started to be written down when Ireland was Christianized from about the 5th century onwards. And those accounts, um, I think, are probably in the main quite accurate. They were probably writing down as people spoke to them. But by that time, the culture of Ireland had changed hugely. And so we've got things about a a very vigorous pagan culture, which has changed religion, being written down by the new religion are who share no belief system with what has just gone before. They're actually, in many cases, actively hostile to it. So how the Irish really saw themselves and defined themselves, we don't really know, because by the time permanent records were made about these things, the culture had already moved on very significantly. So you have to kind of pick through, monks are talking about kings and warriors and druids, and they're saying, but of course, all the power came from the devil, because their powers were evil. And you think, well, let's take out the evil and the devil and the sinful bit, and then read the texts again. The Irish did have a distinct sense of themselves as being different. And how we know that is that in the texts, you can read about them speaking of other people. So they're talking about the Scots, they're talking about the Welsh, they're talking about the Britons. And it's quite clear they see themselves as quite distinct from these people.
So you also mentioning these other cultures, how might they have been different?
Well, Ireland at the time was a series of kingdoms and chiefdoms. I think pretty much everywhere else was. And so I think that people's sense of themselves in terms of identity would have gone something like, I belong to this clan, shall we say. I belong to the clan of the O'Neills, who are the rulers of, not even of Ulster, they're just the rulers of this part of Ireland. So, we're a different people, even from the people who live 2 counties away. And so, even though they might not have had massive cultural differences between them, but the distinctions were very much along the lines of tribes, and then big tribes going into kingdoms. And then the kingdoms, there was a lot of warfare between them. There was a lot of vying for territory, for cattle. In fact, the whole town is a story about the theft of a bull. So they wouldn't have seen themselves as hugely different in the same way that, say, I would see myself as being quite different to an Italian or to a person from Russia, to a person from the United States of America. But they certainly did have a strong identity of being part of this particular family or tribe or clan or even kingdom.
How did that affect them in the sense too of how they perceived magic?
We don't really know how they perceived magic. And this is one of the things that turned out to be really interesting. When I first started to think about Ireland in terms of Irish magic, it just occurred to me one day, I saw there was a wonderful book that came out called The Book of English Magic, which was a nice big fat tome. I know
Hold on.
if you got it there, it's Philip Carr-Gomm, and do you know who the co-author is? I don't have it to hand myself.
This guy.
Ta-da! That's one. Yes. Who? It's Philip Carr-Gomm, and who is the other author?
Richard Haygate.
Richard Haygate. Okay, so this book was everywhere when it came out. It's a very good book, and it just occurred to me: there's no book of Irish magic. There's no history of Irish magic. There's lots of popular books talking about Celtic customs. A lot of it's folklorish. There's books about terrible books about the Druids, which are, basically a lot of made up stuff. But I thought there's no history of actual Irish magic. Why is that? So I started to look into Irish magic, and it was actually quite frustrating because, as I said, by the time the oral culture started to be written down, it was written down by people who were hostile to the pagan culture that they were replacing. And so they didn't thoughtfully write down things like, oh, this is how the Druids did this thing, and this is how the Druids did that thing. So we have some very interesting descriptions of the Druids doing magic, but not how they did it. We don't even know what their belief system was. In fact, we know almost nothing about them. And a lot of the things that are said about them in modern books are the things that aren't actually just made up, come from 19th and 18th century writers, many of whom were just extrapolating the things that classical authors wrote about the British and Gaulish Druids and kind of just pushed the Irish Druids in there, kind of to make up the numbers. So thinking about Irish magic is, it's actually quite tricky because you've got on the one hand this very powerful folkloric culture, which continues today, which is full of little things about the fairies, stuff about the magic in the landscape, a lot of, you know, just stories and things that you get told as a kid, which you learn, which you read. I grew up in Ireland, surrounded by all these amazing stories, which are full of magic. They're full of magical activity. But how do we do that magic? Nobody knows. We simply do not know. So that was one of my first really big challenges is, first of all, that who did magic in ancient Ireland and how did they do it? So most of the magic is done by Druids. And there's probably more nonsense written about Druids than almost any other kind of magical practitioner. They turn up all the time in texts, in the early Irish historical texts. They're just around. Most kings and great chieftains had their own Druids at court. We know their names. We know that there were female Druids. We know many of their names. I think I've gathered around 20 separate instances of women called Druids. And, you know, their function seemed to be, and again, there's no signposting of this. You have to actually read the whole thing and you discover, okay, the Druids, they were advisors, they were legal experts, but most of all, they were magicians. But obviously, by the time the stories are written down, they are described as being pretty evil. But they're not the only magical people in Ireland. The other magical people in Ireland are the Tuatha Dé Danann, who are widely regarded as being the gods of ancient Ireland. And like the Druids, they turn up in a lot of places. They turn up in nearly all the sagas. They have various things that they do, and they're extremely powerful and magical, but we don't know how. So there's no methods. You can't imitate what a particular Druid did to move a mountain in 300 AD because nothing, you know, they chanted spells. I have actually found a few of those. They were able to control the elements, the weather. They could move mountains. They could dam up streams. They could rain fire. They could curse and kill people. But unfortunately, we don't really know how. The Tuatha Dé Danann they don't really practice magic so much as they are magic. They're supernatural. The Leabhar Gaibhil and a Heron has them coming out of the north. They came in a kind of storm cloud, a dark storm cloud, according to one version of the text. And they bring with them a whole people. They bring Druids. They bring what they call husbandmen, who are herders. And they just turn up and suddenly they're in charge. You know, they're the kind of rulers of Ireland. They fight battles. Interestingly enough, though, unlike, say, the classical gods of Greece and Rome, the Tuatha Dé Danann are not immortal. They actually end up being, the Dagda gets killed with a poison dart, for example. Several others are killed in battle. Interestingly enough, several women are killed in battle. And so these are the other magical people of ancient Ireland, about whom, again, we know very little except what comes down to us in legends. They're a different type of supernatural being, and I think this is possibly a point of contact with the Nordic pantheon, for example. So, like the Nordics, um, the Irish gods can die. Um, they also have a lot to do with people. Most of our legends have the Tuatha Danann taking part in events, taking part in battles, um, giving advice, whether it's heeded or not. Um, yeah, they're kind of people, but they're not. They're hugely powerful and magical, but they're also vulnerable, and you know they can be killed. So the history of Irish magic, if you start in that period of time, is actually a big and very frustrating puzzle. What I've tried to do is to extract from a lot of the church annals and accounts of pre-Christian Ireland as much as I can about the actual magical activity of the Druids. And I came across one text, which will be in our forthcoming book, which is basically a magical battle between three sets of Druids. It's an absolutely extraordinary text. I don't know why no one has well, to be fair, it's only been fairly recently translated. But it not only shows you what kind of magic they did, battle magic mostly, but even reproduces the little kind of rhyming incantations that the Druids used to do various forms of magic, including turning a stone into a giant sort of snake or eel, which helps to defeat their enemies. Um, and in another part of the same text, they light a magical fire using very specific woods. Now, this is where you think, well, now this is a method. You had to get wood from three different kinds of trees, make a fire out of it, and then using magic, they were able to cast this fire into the sky where it rained blood and fire on their enemies. Um, that's absolutely fascinating. And so rather than go through 100 texts with just tiny little things saying, and the druid did this and the druid did that, this book is just really about the druids. The two kings involved are almost like a sideshow in this epic battle of two sets of human druids and one set of what's called fairy druids, um, who were sent to help one side against the other, and it all turns out, well, it doesn't turn out too well for them in the end. But it's the only text I've been able to find which is wholly about magic, about the druids as the main characters, not as a sideshow. So I'm hoping that it'll give something of the flavor of what druid magic was really like.
Well, after hearing what you talked about, I was wondering if I could get a signed copy. It sounds like a book worth reading. Oh my God.
Yeah, well, I tried to cover a lot of ground, and it's probably well, there's no consistently long history of magic in Ireland, unfortunately. The colonization of Ireland by the Normans and later by the English meant that there was huge interruptions, that our local our culture was massively interrupted. So things didn't progress the way they did, say, in mainland Europe, where you get the development of medieval magic out of much earlier texts. And there's a fairly smooth line of descent from, say, Egypt and the Middle East into early medieval, middle medieval, um, you know, to Renaissance magic. And all the time you've got books, you've got grimoires, you've got books explaining how to do magic. You've got the development of, say, astrology, which is phenomenal. But none of that happened in Ireland. So what we have is this incredible Celtic Gaelic culture, which is full of a very unique set of ideas about magic and magical practitioners. And then you have the arrival of Christianity, whose spread was actually rather slow. It's not quick, despite, we were brought up on all this kind of, history light ideas that Ireland was Christianized in about 10 minutes by St. Patrick, who was so awesome. It didn't happen like that at all. Ireland was actually quite slow and very gradually Christianized. But by the time you get to the 10th and 11th centuries, we're kind of full on a Christian country. And there's not much magical activity taking place. The old magic of the Druids has fallen away. And in important ceremonies like the crowning of a king, or the acclamation of a chieftain, these were hugely important ceremonies. But the Druids that used to do it have now been replaced by priests and bishops. And that continues on. But this is clearly where one set of personnel were replaced, but nobody said anything about it because it did happen over a long period of time. And then you get to the period, you get to the 13th and 14th centuries where bingo, magic comes back in a way. And that is because we had one of the biggest and earliest witch trials, a so-called witch trial in Europe, which happened in Kilkenny. But again, this isn't really Irish magic. This is an import which came with a particular bishop who decided that this woman was a witch. But witchcraft wasn't illegal in Ireland. There were no laws against witchcraft. Anyone could be a witch. And we know that witches, for example, existed in Ireland. They were even mentioned in the old texts, women practicing witchcraft, sorceresses, as distinct from female druids. But this was a kind of mainstream European medieval witch hunt. And the poor woman was tried for heresy, because that was the only thing they could try her for. So that was quite interesting in a kind of demonstration of how much mainstream European thinking about the supernatural had come into Ireland, but only insofar as it came into a town, a Norman town, which was settled by Normans and some Dutch and Flemish people and British people. It was almost nothing to do with native Irish people at all. And so this is another thing I talk about, which is this arrival of ideas about witches, which are absolutely not anything that ever took place in Irish culture before. Even though there clearly were people known as witches in Ireland, but they weren't the kind of people, they weren't horrifyingly scary people who, like in the European tradition, were stealing babies and blighting crops and killing cattle and people and children. It wasn't like that at all. The thing that Alice Kittler, the Kilkenny witch, was accused of, apart from heresy, was poisoning. But then they had to throw in all the kind of devilish stuff as well. She consorted with demons. She didn't go to mass. She didn't take the sacraments. Which sounds really tame when you think about it. And she quite wisely fled the country. She just disappears. And her poor servant is actually publicly burned alive in Kilkenny. Probably because they couldn't get their hands on the person they really wanted to burn. So that was a kind of odd aspect of Irish magic. There were a couple of other cases where people were accused of magic. And again, they always took place. Hannah Newton, who was a witch in Youghal in County Cork, this was an English settler town. These are not Irish people as we understand it. These were people with imported ideas about witchcraft and about women. And all the people involved in it, similarly, they're all English. And this is something that you will not find in what they called the native Irish, out in the kind of heartlands of Ireland, where people were still fully Irish speaking, still carrying on the remnants of old Gaelic culture. you will not find a single trial for witchcraft or any mention of women being persecuted for witchcraft. Um, and that was one strange aspect of Irish magic, which I felt I had to put in because if nothing else, it highlights the big difference. You were talking earlier about what's the difference between, say, Irish magic and other magic. One of the main differences is we don't have this thing that witches are evil, that they're everywhere, that they're doing harm. One of the other things which is probably unique to Ireland, is the absolutely widespread belief in the fairies. This is one thing that Ireland is very famous for. And it's true. Up until recently, I would say a significant minority of people in Ireland really did believe in the fairies. It's not just something they're saying to amuse tourists. For example, my own grandmother, who grew up on a tiny farm in the west of Ireland, she believed in the fairies. It wasn't in any self-conscious way. It was just part and parcel of how people were, to the extent that she had various little things she would do to keep the fairies away. The fairies were malevolent. They were harmful. They hurt cattle. They stole your milk. They could, when my mother used to visit, my mother comes from the other side of the country, and my mother would come to visit her, and she was expecting a baby, my younger sister, and my grandmother was terrified that my mother would see a hare or a rabbit on the bog when she was going for a walk. And she told her, if that ever happens, if you see one running, you have to take the lining of your skirt and tear it. And that will turn aside the kind of evil that will otherwise mean that your baby will be born with a birth defect. I mean, she was absolutely serious. So this is something I did also include in the Irish magic, because so much of the folk magic in Ireland relates to the fairies. A lot of it is things to either turn away the harm that they are capable of doing, though sometimes they're also capable of doing tremendous good, and to counteract their magic, basically. It's not, big magic. They're little things, you put on, they hate iron, obviously. That's a very widespread belief in Europe. The fairies don't like iron. So you put iron on things, like on the doors. You can stud them with iron nails. You would they used to put saucers of milk out for them on windowsills when they were making the cream, churning the butter, because if the butter doesn't churn, you obviously anger the fairies in some way. It's still going on today. There's places where the local authorities want to build a road, and there's a little thorn tree. Now, lone thorn trees are always associated with the fairies, and the locals will literally say, you can't cut that down. That's the fairy tree. You know, and there have been cases where a road has been diverted around one tree because of the locals' belief that it is a fairy tree, and cutting it down will bring really bad luck to the community. So that's another aspect of Irish magic, which is probably now unique. I don't think many people in Europe still either believe in the fairies or act as if they were real, to the extent, in agricultural communities, of doing all these little things to keep them away.
Yeah. Now, can we just quickly define fairies, like the word, and then what the actual being is?
Fairies. Oh, that's a tough one. The fairies, as we now understand them, is a bit of a mashup of 19th century writers going around. There was a guy called Thomas Crofton Croker, who in the early 19th century walked around Ireland and literally just asked people about the stories about the fairies. And in those days, and this still was true in the rural Ireland of my childhood, was country people kept their door open, or they had a half door, and any stranger could come up to the house knock the door and say, can I sit by your fire? Can I warm myself up? Can I have a glass of water? And it was always the custom to say yes. So he did this. He walked around the countryside, he knocked on doors, he sat by firesides, he asked people to tell him the stories, and they told him these amazing folk tales of the fairies. Um, and at that point, it's interesting because the fairies are said to be quite small. But this is obviously something that's happened over time because the older beliefs, the fairies aren't small. They're actually the same size as human beings and frequently bigger. So we've got this kind of shrinkage of supernatural beings. So, for example, in medieval texts, they talk about fairy women, banshee, um, and they're not small. They're exactly the same size or bigger than human beings. But the word, the she, is another one of those things that requires explanation. She literally means a mound. And in Ireland is full of these mounds, most of which contain the ruins of old Neolithic graves or other types of building. And it was widely believed that in them lived these invisible beings, often referred to as the Tuatha Danann. So it was a belief that after the Milesians came to Ireland, they defeated the Tuatha Danann and they split the country in two, with the Milesians getting above the ground, but the Tuatha Danann got the underground. So mounds and caves and hills all over the country are associated with the fairies, but actually in the older stories, they're associated with full-size supernatural beings who were probably the Tuatha Danann. But by the 19th century, when people like Croker and another man called Cately are going around the countryside talking to people, um, the inhabitants of these mounds are often thought to be little folk, like the leprechaun and the other little harmless uh, people, beings. Um, so the fairies in Ireland is very much a mixed bag. They can be tiny little beings. You can see them in the hedgerows. Um, I suppose the most famous of them is the leprechaun, who apparently makes shoes for the fairies and gets paid in gold. So if you can catch one, they'll give you gold, etc., etc. That's a really popular one. But there are other less well-known beings which live in these mounds, and this is why a lot of our Neolithic sites were actually preserved accidentally, which was that people were afraid of them. They wouldn't go to them. They wouldn't take a stone off them. You would never take something from a place like that, for example, to build your house, because the fairies would come and demand the stone back. I mean, there's lots of folk tales about people doing silly stuff like that and ending up in absolutely horrible situations. So when people are talking about fairies in Ireland, they're probably talking about the little people, as they call them, but they're also talking about powerful supernatural beings. That tended to fall away, and in the modern period, we're just usually just talking about little cute people who live in the hills. You can hear them making music at night. They play the fiddle and all that. There's loads of stories, and they're all quite charming. Um, but the definition of the word fairy, it doesn't have a hard definition. It's pretty much if they're magical, supernatural, live in the she or the mounds, and can do kind of, weird things that people can't do, they're probably a fairy of one kind or another.
This is something that I never had heard of before, and there were human and fairy druids you mentioned in one story.
Yeah.
Um, could we start with identifying what is druid, or how that word can be, or if it comes
It's
from another word?
Yeah, linguistically, the word druid is thought to come from, well, there's two possible roots. One is that it comes from the word for an oak tree, which in Irish is dara, but in the Celtic group of languages that Irish comes from, it's got a root like dur or dru. So they're the people of the oak tree. Now, that doesn't really hold water in Ireland because, unlike the British and Gaelic druids, who are closely associated with oak trees. In Ireland, the Druids, nearly all the stories relating them to woods and trees, it's the rowan tree, which is quite a small little tree, or the hazel tree. Those are the two really magical trees in Ireland. So the other root of the word is the Irish word for magic itself, which is driocht, which is much more likely. So a druid is a person who is magic or does magic. Is basically your name is magic. So a woman druid is called a ban driocht, i.e. a woman, a magic woman. And I think that's pretty much the explanation of it. So whatever other jobs that they might have done, the name for them is a magic person, magic man, magic woman.
Okay. And so in the West, particularly in media, when it comes up, people talk about druids. They talk about them being like a secluded group that takes time just to be initiated into.
Mm-hmm.
Are these truths to it at all, or?
Well, I think there's some truth in it. We come across druids like there seems to be quite a strong suggestion that Druidism was hereditary. So we have mentions of Druids in the texts whose son is a Druid, or whose, in some cases, daughter is a Druid. One of the greatest Druids of Ireland was a guy called Mogra, and he had a daughter called Tlachta, and she was a tremendously powerful Druid, according to the texts. And he also had a son, at least one son, who was a druid as well. They didn't seem to live apart from the rest of society. I'm sure they had their secrets, which would only be transmitted to those that they were training. But in terms of their everyday lives, they did seem to live along with everybody else, particularly if they were the druids that were associated with the king and were part of his court. It wouldn't really have been feasible for them to kind of live in groves of trees, though I'm sure there were solitary practitioners as well. But it looks like they were integrated into society like everybody else. One interesting thing about them is, though, that we don't really know what they believed, but there's a small suggestion that they actually practiced a different religion or spiritual path from everybody else. There's one or two cases in the texts of the Druids talking about their god. It literally says in the text, the god of the Druids. They don't give his name, but they don't say the gods. They say the god of the Druids, most specifically. And in one text, there's a report of an incantation where the Druid actually says, addressing the heavens, my God, the God of the Druids, who is above every other god. Oh, hang on a minute. That's not the gods for everybody else. It's clear they were running their own secret Druid religion. Unfortunately, they didn't bother to tell anybody what it was about. But I think, like most people in the ancient world who had a priesthood, if you like, or a magical grouping of some kind, it was absolutely secret. The initiations, again, absolutely secret. So I think anybody could become a druid, but also druids could be druidism, druidship, if you like, could be passed down through families as well.
That's that is very unique. It's interesting. It's also kind of funny because it's got this natural theatric quality to it, like something you would almost hear out of a book or a movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm curious now. So there was a couple of small stories or narratives I had heard about druids. One being it was a secluded group that would assign to all of its members, like, you're supposed to go do all of this research on this one subject, you do research on that one subject, which sounded interesting. And as a collective, they would share the things that they would learn in their studies. And then there was another story too. This one is, if it's true, this is I'm curious to learn more about them. Apparently, they were so well studied with nature. This was a group of people that could live out in the wilderness without shelter or normal, human structure and provisions, and they could do things like remain invisible amongst a pack of wolves walking by. They could
Mm.
walk by and not be detected.
Mm. I haven't read anything that specific about the Druids, but I think it is probably the case that, like other kinds of people, they seem to be massively in touch with the natural world to the extent that they're able to, as I said before, to affect the landscape. They're able to affect weather. There's lots of evidence that they could call up storms and calm storms as well. It would not surprise me if they were able to live um, quite apart from, should we call, civilization, and just live off the land. Uh, Also, the climate in those days, I mean, Northwestern Europe isn't horrendously cold. There was food everywhere in the wild. You read about the rivers leaping with salmon, and yeah, there's basically, I'm sure you could live extremely close to nature in a certain amount of comfort if you wanted to be, pursue that lone path. And again, having that harmony with the elements of nature would mean that you were, I find it quite believable that they could be comfortable with wild animals and not be harmed by them. But interestingly enough, these are often stories that in Ireland are made about the early monks, many of whom were actually solitary, many of them were hermits. And um, I wonder, from what you've said, if those stories are not just stories about the Druids in which the person of the Druid has been removed and been replaced by, a fairly new convert to Christianity. There's stories of wolves bringing food to these saints that are living in a cave. So yes, it's possible.
Wow, that is really unique. I didn't ever look at it like that before. And um, were the were was early Ireland and the Celtic people? Do we know if they also had naturally that really that closeness with nature or even worshipped nature?
I don't know if worshipped is the right word. We actually don't really know what religious practices um, the pre-Christian Irish actually did as a people. Um, they lived in a very magical landscape, and it's clear that they, had a strong belief in the magical powers of the Druids and the gods. Um, but we don't really know what their own. They weren't. They didn't have a self-conscious relationship with nature. In fact, they may not have regarded nature as being separated from them at all. I think you get that idea of man versus nature. It's very much um, something that comes in from probably from the Judeo-Christian tradition. My feeling is that um, people of that time, not just in Ireland, but in most places, were kind of inseparable from nature. It would have probably struck them as odd if you said to them, "Oh wow, you're really in touch with the natural world," and they'll say, "I don't know what you mean. That's the world," you know.
Yeah, yeah, that time period. I mean, it was normal. I mean, because you were trying to make sure that you had what you needed to survive winter. I mean, it's really what it
Mm,
boiled down to is having an understanding. And I was just talking to somebody about this too, I mean, well into the early 1900s.
mm,
Um, Sometimes in certain places, probably as far as the 1960s, uh,
mhm.
you had to have that relationship. So that would have been that is kind of a new thought, like, oh yeah, that's just the way life is.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We're the people who were separated from nature and now see it as something other and very different to us. But I think that's quite a modern way of thinking about, being human in the world.
Yeah. Now you talked about the gods dying earlier, and I, I'm curious to know if the gods, if in this belief when they died they were dead, or if there was some sort of transcending properties beyond physical existence within these beliefs.
Unfortunately, that's yet another of the things we don't really know, um, is beliefs in the afterlife. Now, the archaeological record in Ireland probably, I would say, strongly suggests that there was a belief in an afterlife, but we wouldn't know if the gods went there or not. Um, when the gods died in the legends, that's it, they're gone. They never turn up again. And the stories move on to a new phase. For the people, the sheer number of monuments that are aligned to the rising sun or to various other important points, like particular times of the year, it is, I think, it's not too much of a stretch to think that they did believe in an afterlife and they believed that everybody went there. They may have gone there, with the rising sun or with the setting sun being translated into another mode of existence somewhere else. Um, there's some suggestions as well that things like Tir na Nog, the Isles of the Blessed, High Brazel is a place where people can go when they die. Um, so I think it is possible that um, our pagan ancestors did believe in an afterlife, but unfortunately, again, there's no texts that support. There's no story about a hero dies and goes to the afterlife. There's no Valhalla, though they may have believed in it. We just don't know.
Okay. Now, was there any archaeology that shown that even if the gods or the hero might have been dead, they would have still carried like an amulet or a ring or stitched something on a piece of clothing or painted something on a shield?
In for, do you mean to signify who they were, or
Yeah, as like, would somebody have carried around like a certain, like a Morrigan uh, amulet or a seraphim?
there's no, there isn't a single item. If you look at, and there's so many grave goods, most of them incredibly beautiful and extraordinarily valuable. These huge golden torques, these wonderful hair ornaments and rings and great big arm, and all made out of like 23.5 pounds and pounds of it. They're all abstract. All the decoration on them is, what you'd expect, beautiful circular designs. There's no depiction of a god or a goddess. There's a couple of small finds that have been tried to be identified as a god, but we can't identify who they are. Like, for example, there's a couple of statues of heads, one of which is in the National Museum in Ireland. It's actually like a double or triple head, which may be a god, but there's no name carved on it. Um, there was another um, little stone guy about this size who was found in, I think, County Antrim, I think. And he has been identified as Lou. But again, that's a fairly tentative identification based on the position of his arm. And who knows? But unfortunately, we've never found, as you described, a grave with a person wearing an amulet or anything that depicts what you could say is a person or an identifiable being. And this, interestingly enough, became really important later on in my research when I started writing about W.B. Yeats and his Celtic order. This became hugely problematic for them because his idea was the old Irish gods and goddesses, but they had no idea what they looked like. And for somebody like him who's steeped in the imagery of the Golden Dawn, where you know exactly what Isis looks like, you know exactly what Osiris looks like, nobody knows what Cuchulainn looked like. Nobody knows what the dagda looked like. And he was engaged in these psychic sessions, these scrying sessions with some of his other Golden Dawn fellow adepts. And the main focus of all their work initially was to get the images of the gods, because from his point of view, you couldn't even begin to do evocations or contact the gods in any way unless you knew what you were looking at. So they had to start from nothing. And they did these sessions, which were very interesting. But they were always, what's the color of, what the colors associated with Lugh? What animals are you associating with Deirdre? And so on. It's fascinating, but it does highlight this problem of imaging, image making. There are just simply nothing to go on.
Because there's one statue, at least here in the States, made famous of or carving of what's believed to be Ceranos, the Lord
Believed to be? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Ceranos, Lord of the Forest.
The other image I've seen, which is associated with him, is the Gundestrup cauldron. There's this wonderful horned-headed god on it. Yes, I actually saw this in the British Museum a few years ago. They had an absolutely amazing exhibition on Celtic Europe, and they allowed this to travel to England. Um, it's just the most wonderful piece of art. There's no equivalent of Cernunnos in Irish mythology, as far as we know. There's no description of any god with a great big set of antlers. I mean, I love this. Don't get me wrong; it's wonderful.
Oh, I do too. I've it's great. Um, so this was not in. There's no Celtic or Irish myths involving this guy.
Celtic, yes, he turns up in
Well, I mean, like Celtic Ireland. Sorry, I said.
yeah, not in Ireland. No, he's strictly this horned-headed god is very much a British um Celtic, Welsh Celtic god.
There's no good. There's no good Brits.
No, when looking for the Irish gods, like Yeats, you have to rely on a kind of psychic questing, really.
That's neat. That's really neat because everyone because here I don't know how it is over in Europe, but immediately Celts are tied straight into Ireland, and so therefore guilty as charged. Sir Nunos is tied in with it. So that's definitely a very interesting, different understanding now because I'd always thought that that was a part of the pantheon.
No, not at all. Um, very much confined to, as I said, British and Welsh mythology.
Yeah,
We don't have a horned-headed god in Ireland, which I actually think is a bit of a pity. I think it's just such a powerful image of this sort of man animal, and the shape shifting. Um, but hey, we've got other things.
yeah, exactly. Um, so how so are you able to have looked at differences in Irish Celtic versus other the rest of the Celtic kingdom?
I haven't done any real comparisons. It's a very big field. For example, Welsh mythology is a huge field with lots of texts. And I think without the language as well, it's very difficult. We know that there were very vibrant pagan cultures all over Europe, and some of which persisted really quite late. For example, in Scandinavia, uh, paganism and pagan images come right up, till a few hundred years ago, and they've had some very interesting finds in Europe as well. Which were actually at that exhibition in the British Museum. There was a wonderful carved wooden figure, which is probably a god figure, which came from Germany. And it was just so amazing to see a statue, if you like. It's quite big. I think it's about 5 feet tall. It was just amazing to see. something like that because so little has survived in Ireland and, in the British Isles generally. Uh, so, anything, even if our cultures weren't very alike, then there certainly is some points of contact. But again, it's such a big field of study. And so many things were changing quite rapidly in Europe as well. Whereas in Ireland, on the margins, things just tend to stay the same. You don't get the same throughput of peoples and cultures and ideas as you do in the center of things. So in a way, we're kind of living archaeology. We were kind of left to our own devices for a long time.
That truly is unique. And what comes also to mind, so the people that eventually became the Celts and the
Mm.
Tuatha De Danann, do we know anything about them beyond the writings? Do we have any understanding?
I don't know if I don't know if archaeology could be helpful here. The text that we have, the Book of Invasions, is quite clear that there were these waves of people who came to live in Ireland, and the stories are quite an interesting. Um, you know, if you want to know how the Irish saw themselves in ancient times, the Book of Invasions is probably a good place to start. Their ancestors came from Egypt. They came from the Middle East. Um, they're quite clear about that. And then there's a series of, they call them invasions, but they're not, at least not initially. They're just people literally coming to live in a pretty much unpopulated land, which is exactly what happened in Ireland after the melting of the last great ice age. The land was empty. So you have these people turning up, very fanciful stories about the one of them was a pharaoh's daughter. Another one is a guy who is the only survivor of an invasion who lives in a cave for 900 years while the country's depopulated again. So you have people like Kesser and Partalon and Fintan, and then a bit later the Tuatha De Danann turn up, and they are the supreme Irish dudes. They turn up with all their druids and this, that, and the other, and then history or prehistory really gets going. But they're not the last act at all. Next thing, the Milesians turn up, and the Milesians are part of an even earlier story, but they've kind of looped back around again. It's quite complicated, which also involves the fall of the Tower of Babel, among other things, just to kind of tie it all back into things that people knew about in the early Middle Ages because everybody knew the Bible. Um, so that's basically how the Irish see themselves. We're the descendants of these various waves of people, ending with the Milesians, who are the modern Irish, if you like, the Irish. The Celts didn't actually come to Ireland until about 500 BC. I mean, that's really late. And the people that were before that were probably Celts as well, but we don't know because their language didn't survive. So we end up just sort of circling back to, but who were they? But, the archaeological record is it's quite good for some things, but again, as we discussed with burials and stuff like that, so many things didn't survive.
Yeah, unfortunate. Now there's the Ogham writing system, the Ogham alphabet. I know there's some carvings at least. Has that given any sort of allowance to understand a little further?
No, Ogham is a very, very rudimentary language. I think there's several hundred examples of it, almost all of them in Ireland, though there have been a few found in Scotland and actually a few found in Wales. It's seems to have only been used to say very rudimentary things like this is the grave of X person or the name of a place. They're usually just names. They may be gravestones, we don't know. But apart from that, they don't really give much information of any kind, which is interesting because we know that there were several Ogham alphabets. One of the medieval Irish texts, I think, could be the Book of Ballymote, actually gives examples of them, of the different systems of writing. My own personal feeling is that it was used to inscribe things on wood, and almost nothing in wood has survived in Ireland, because it just doesn't. Things get broken, things get burnt, things get damp, and they rot away. If it was used for ordinary writing, it was used on wood, and whatever it was used for is now gone. So we're just left with a few stone examples, which could be boundary markers or gravestones.
Okay.
So unfortunately, no help. If you're looking for the gods of ancient Ireland, you won't find it there, I'm afraid.
Fortunate. Now, on my hat, I did this initially for St. Patrick's Day, but I put the Troy horses,
Oh, yes.
little button.
That's really pretty, actually.
Thank you. My
Yeah.
friends from Dragon's Nest Design make very lovely jewelry like that.
Mm.
Was this something that was actually in the Irish and Irish Celtic culture or beliefs at all?
The three horses. I'm not familiar with it. I have seen the design, but I don't know if is it actually Irish or is it from one of the other?
I I I don't know if it was a result of a New Age or a Wiccan influence,
Yeah.
or the thing with triple god, triple goddess. I don't know if that's. And have you seen anything along those lines and
Well,
anything?
most of the very ornate stuff, I think that's actually modern, but most of the beautifully ornate design work like that is actually from manuscripts. Um, and nearly all of it is Christian. The rock art from the earlier period is really quite different. You have these amazing um, decorated curbstones, they're called, around the monument at Newgrange and at Knowth, with um, they're hugely abstract, though we don't know what they are. Some people have suggested that they're star maps. Other people think they're geographical maps, which they could be. Other people, because one or two of the stones have these rayed designs that look like almost rays of the sun halfway, they think they may have been used for calculating sun and moon cycles. And again, that's quite likely. Um, but much of that beautiful ornate strapwork design is what has come down to us, is mostly on vellum in Celtic Irish manuscripts, or in metalwork, which was phenomenally ornate, absolutely extraordinarily beautiful, and almost impossible to duplicate. You can see it in items like the Tara brooch, the Derry na Flan chalice, the Arda chalice. Um, but again, these are all Christian things that are used for the mass and for Christian worship.
Unique Christian creations. And
Well, they were clearly using things that people already knew how to do. They didn't actually introduce any new art, as far as I know. But the thing, for example, with precious metals is the reason we don't have much um, stuff designed from that earlier period is metal is too precious to be just left lying around. It's constantly being reused. It would be resmelted and remade. So, for example, um, when Christianity finally achieved the kind of importance in that local kings started to give gifts to monasteries and to saints, they would probably just say to their own workmen, because monasteries didn't employ goldsmiths, kings did. They would have said to them, okay, melt down that drinking cup, that gold drinking cup, and make a cross. But the craftswomen would have just made something with the same decoration that they might have used for everything else. Like the king, for all we know, had um, things for his horse's bridle, which could have been every bit as ornate and beautiful, but they tended to get melted down and used for something else.
Fascinating. So that's how the Celtic cross came into.
Mm. Yeah, the crosses with all their hugely ornate designs, the design work behind them is probably pagan, but all the depictions of things on them, like the crucifixion, and are obviously firmly Christian. But I don't think they invented the the very traditional and iconic Celtic style. I think that was already there and being used on lots of other things as well.
Incredible. Um, so now that brings me to another question of a symbol, the Celtic knot.
Yeah.
That was that a Christian art result?
No, I don't think so. I think it was there already. Um, I think it achieved its highest um, expression, if you like, under the influence of Christianity, because when the church became powerful and very wealthy, they were the people who were commissioning these kind of works, or kings and lords who were um, giving gifts to the monasteries and to the abbots were commissioning the works. But I don't think you can just make a decorative language from nothing. Everything comes from something else. Um, and we can see in some of the earlier, the gold work, the huge hoards of torques and other beautiful gold work in Ireland. Metalwork in Ireland was very advanced. They made beautiful, very ornate things, and they had been doing it for quite a long time. So it wouldn't have been much of a stretch for them to just start saying, okay, instead of making a really ornate breastplate for a king, I'm actually going to make a casket to keep a saint's bell in. And basically just, the same again, but with Christianity.
Yeah. And is there anything that might have talked about the knot at all or its purpose?
I don't know if it was purposeful as such. It's in all the examples that you see, whether it's on carved stone or metalwork, it's used to fill what would normally be empty space. It's pretty clear they didn't like empty space on their decorative objects. There's from the manuscripts to bell shrines to rock art, I mean, to Celtic crosses and other things like that. Every single bit of space is filled. There's no empty space. The lettering is hugely ornate. Um, and one of the ways to, this is my personal opinion based on being in my previous incarnate, well, not previous incarnation, but I used to be a jeweler and metalworker and silversmith. Um, if you want to make decorative things using gold wire, you just start to twist them and knot them. And if you make a shape and start twisting them and knotting them, you get these incredibly complex but very symmetrical designs. And I think that a lot of the bigger artworks came out of goldsmiths using very fine gold wire to fill in the spaces on pieces of jewelry, like things like the Tara brooch, and then just going from the tiny scale to the big scale.
Yeah.
But it's still, that's just a personal view.
But still, that's a very interesting thought because I've heard things about it's a protection. It's kind of like the Buddhist belief of the infinite knot.
Oh, yes. It's possible that, it seems to have been very widespread in a lot of cultures that continuous snaking lines that meet each other. One is that they catch demons, for example, or confuse them so that bad luck and evil is kept away simply by having these, you know, even just a little example of one. And there's no reason to think that Ireland was any different. And certainly the sheer amount of knots, knotwork, interlacing, which you can literally scarcely follow with your eye, they're so complex, may have been intended to have that kind of protective effect, as well as being beautifully decorative.
Very beautifully decorative.
Mm.
And yeah, that does make sense. I mean, in England, I mean, they eventually adopted the five-pointed star because they believed it would have helped confuse demons in Christian.
Yeah, it had another um, reason why it's used. You even see it in churches in England, but the reason is that it's supposed to depict the five wounds of Christ.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
so he had two in his hands, one in his side, two in his feet.
Okay.
So there's, I think, a couple of churches in England that actually have a five, a pentagram in the window, like a pentacle. And people are saying, oh my God, did they have kind of mixed magic mixed with Christianity? No, they really didn't. But it's a powerfully, whether you're a pagan or a Christian or which, the five-pointed star has its importance and its power in each tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how they adopt. I mean,
Mm,
kind of fascinating too how in such early cultures it would have been and into the prehistoric it would have gone from this equilateral cross and
mm,
infinite knot like
mm.
symbol, and then eventually you get things like the five-pointed star, the six-pointed star, and that is truly unique. So you have this publishing company called HolyThorn.
Yes, I started HolyThorn Press with my husband James about 3 years ago now. Um, I had always wanted to do something like this, and it was COVID and lockdown that really got me to move, basically start doing it. I I had been looking at a woman who had been a very important member of the Golden Dawn, a woman called Florence Farr. She was also a very famous actress in her day, and she had written a series of Egyptian rituals. She had her own little group working separately from her Golden Dawn work, but also slightly involved. And she had received these guidance and the rituals from an Egyptian, um, well, she called him an adept, a great adept. And so these rituals had been written down in a notebook by one of the people involved in her group. And it is the only surviving manuscript. We knew that she ran the group, but very little of it had survived. And somebody suggested to me, why don't you publish them? They're there in the library at the United Grand Lodge of England, the head Freemasonic society. Um, why don't you just have a look at them and transcribe them and publish them? So I did. And we did this small print run with these little hardback book, and they sold out literally like I was worried people wouldn't buy. I was thinking, oh God, suppose I end up with shelves full of books. They sold out in a fortnight. And we went to a second edition a few months later. So that was our big start, was because it's something I'm personally very interested in, which is the history of the Golden Dawn. It's one of the most important occult events of the last several hundred years is its foundation, with these amazing people being involved in it, including the naughty Mr. Crowley, but people of much better character as well. And it also tied in really neatly with my big interest in W.B. Yeats and his occult and magical work. So we published Florence Farr's Egyptian Rituals. That did really well. Then we did somebody who is really not well known, but a very important sort of background shadowy figure, um, who was the teacher of Dion Fortune, who's much better known, obviously, at the Society of the Inner Light. And she had a teacher who was a man called Moriarty. She refers to him several times in her work. And she made him basically the star of her short stories, the Casebook of Dr. Taverner. Well, Dr. Taverner is Moriarty. What do we know about him? Almost nothing. And almost everything we do know about him is actually untrue. But we did find a series of lectures that he'd given to his select group of students, one of whom was Dion Fortune, way back in probably around 1917, 1918. And some of the notes, very meticulous notes, had been taken by one of his students, and we were given access to this. So we published that. He called the whole series The Mystery of Man. And then a lot of it is, it's very theosophical, it's very philosophical. We published that because there's nothing really, not much known about him. So we did some background research into him as well. And that also had, quite a bit of interest. So then we decided to jump sideways a little bit, and we published an updated version of one of the major English texts on witchcraft, which was originally published as Sadducismus Triumphatus in 1681. But it's not just a book about witchcraft and witch trials, it's a book about the supernatural. So it's got a big section of ghost stories, some of them extremely strange. And they're not made up. These are actually collected events that were going on in England in around between, say, 1640 to 1675 or so on. So there's stories of ghosts coming back, people coming back from the dead, people being warned about things, dreadful things that were going to happen, and either taking action against it or doing nothing. There's one, the odd case of a woman being stalked, a young girl, like a young lady, being stalked by a person who seems to be a ghost. Or is he? Is he a real person? It's very ambivalent and ambiguous. There's stories about, there's one story about the King of England, Charles I, who, as you know, was executed by the parliamentarians. And there was a tree in Oxford associated with him. I think it might have been even, no, not part of his estates, but it was an important tree, and it was associated with the king. And they cut it down after he'd been executed. The tree was cut down, and it was burned in a house as firewood. And when they started to burn this, all of this really terrifying supernatural events started to take place. Lots of poltergeist activity, and other really unsettling things like that. And so it's the first book of sort of Fortean phenomena reported to people who wrote it down and collected it. One of them was a very famous Cambridge philosopher called Henry Moore, and he supplied a lot of the stories that went into it. So it's a very difficult text to read. It's written in the old 17th century style, where the S's are written as an F. So we modernized the text and published that. There's some very interesting things in it about witch trials as well, including for us something quite personal, because one of the main reports of witchcraft was set in Somerset. In these little towns, we were living in Somerset at the time, in Glastonbury, and the town where most of these witches came from was literally just 10 miles away. So we did these things of going out onto the land, finding the places that they'd met in the woods, the kind of scary woods. We found a very interesting object, which I've written about on my blog, and generally just trying to get a sense of what it must have been like to be an uneducated person in England in maybe 1664 was when this all broke out, and finding yourself in the dock in front of a magistrate, being accused of killing somebody by witchcraft. And this was a time of great social upheaval in England as well. There were lots of other things going on. It wasn't just the fear of witches. There were lots of nonconformist people like the Quakers who were accused of being little better than, demon worshippers as well. So this book also is, it's basically a history of witchcraft. It's got witchcraft in other countries as well. And we've got our big forthcoming book, of course, is The History of Irish Magic. And that is basically what a lot of the things we've talked about this evening, plus the magical revival in Ireland with Yeats and Russell and Maud Gonne, all working on trying to revive the Irish gods, to make them real again. They had initiatory rituals which have never been published, um, taking people through these different stages of development, modeled on what they're called the four treasures of the Tuatha Danann, which are the sword, starting with the cauldron, the stone, the sword, and the spear. And Yeats had a fifth inner order ritual as well, added on to the end of it. So that was absolutely fascinating. We also found another completely unknown person, an artist who only died in 1954, who was also an Irish magician. And again, another person he truly believed that the future destiny of Ireland was to be a pagan country in which the gods were worshipped again. Made this beautiful book. He used to take his manuscript paper and vellum up to Tara and lay it on the Leah Fall on the Stone of Destiny and wait for the inspiration to come. And yeah, he's just an amazing guy. His name is Art O'Murnahan, and his family are still around. They gave us access to a lot of his unpublished materials. And again, this is really fascinating stuff for anyone who's interested in Irish magic. And we've got next year's going to be really busy. We've got a few more really interesting things in the pipeline, which I can't really say anything about now. But history of Irish magic is going to be our big thing next year.
Yeah, it'll be exciting. Exciting to read about.
I'll get you a copy.
Excellent. Perfect. Perfect. And yeah, maybe have more discussions on also.
I'd be very happy to talk to you again when the book comes out, or when we've got more kind of news about it. Yeah, I think oh gosh, we have been yakking.
Yeah, we have been. All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Sally North. You got a message for future generations?
Yes, look after your sacred sites. Don't leave rubbish on them. Don't tie things on trees. Don't let people run all over stone monuments. If you don't look after them, they just won't be there. They'll be destroyed. That's my message.
Good one. It's a good one.